Just going to kick off. So, welcome. Thanks for coming. Appreciate your time. My name's Evan from the Australian Electoral Commission, of course. I'm the Director of Media and Digital Engagement there, so look after our media engagement, our social channels and a few other bits and pieces. Purpose of today's session is because we've got to run a federal election, obviously, in the coming months. If I was asking for tips on a date over here, but getting nothing, which is disappointing. We'll have about 10 or 15 minutes up front where we're talking to you, providing a bit of a briefing, and then the rest is questions. We've got an hour for the session. It is a hard out because Jeff's going to the airport. Likely excuse, I think. But anyway. So that's how the session will run. It's on the record. Obviously, there's mics and cameras. We have a feed. A lot of people online as well, and I'm hoping that someone will shout out at me if they cannot hear. If there are questions that don't come through online, I might repeat them before we give the answer as well. So that's basically what we're here for. Jeff Pope, the new Electoral Commissioner as of late last year, but not new to the AEC in any way, was the Deputy Electoral Commissioner since 2016, and a number of other roles within that. Chair of the Electoral Integrity Assurance Task Force for much of that period, Chair of the Disability Advisory Committee, the Indigenous Champion for the agency, and I'm sure other things that he's going to say. Why didn't you say that? Because he's vacated the deputy spot, we also have a new deputy as of late last year, and that's Kath Gleeson. Over to my left, same as Jeff, new to that role but not new to the AEC, has been the National Elections Manager and pulled the strings on the operation for the last 2 federal elections, and the person that I go to if I have any operational questions at all. So good people at the desk. You have some handouts. So there's a media reporting guide, which I hope has some helpful information in there for you. There's a handout there about the state of the electoral roll, which I'm yet to see another country that has a better electoral roll, so there's a good rundown in there about that. There's a seat status fact sheet, which is obviously interesting to do with the margins of the seats going into the event. There has been a few redistributions, so largely they reflect 2022 federal election results, but in New South Wales, WA and Victoria, those boundaries have shifted, and quite substantially in some areas as well. There's also a media release, a couple of media releases, one that we put out last week, which is about all of our assistance for candidates and the fact that nomination forms are available. There's also one that's going out now, if my team's doing their job back at the office really well, which is about a range of new voter guides and materials in the world of electoral communication. So have a read of that as well, and I'm sure there'll be questions about that topic. Somebody will tell me if I've missed something later on, but I don't think I have, so I might hand over to Jeff to give the upfront briefing.
Great. Well, thanks, Evan, and good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for taking the time to be with us this morning. I reckon I'll probably talk for about 10 minutes. Some of this stuff you may already know, but I'm just going to be a little more fulsome just to make sure everyone captures the picture. The first thing I wanted to also acknowledge is the importance of the role of the media during the election. You've got an incredibly important role to play, and we look forward to working with you and supporting you in that role. I know we say this probably every election, but we are about to deliver again Australia's largest peacetime logistical event, and some of the stats that I'll give you will be an insight into why that might be the case. So obviously the election has to have a minimum of 33 days from announcement until polling day. Close of rolls will start on the issue of the writ, which goes for 7 days. Nominations period is normally for about a 10-day period, but that will depend on the timetable that is provided in the issue of the writ. We'll have 2 weeks of early voting and 2 weeks of remote voter services as well. In many respects, if you remove the COVID overlay that was present in 2022, it's going to look and feel effectively like the 2022 federal election. Evan's already touched on, of course, there's 150 seats in the House of Representatives for this election. That comes on the back of the redistributions in New South Wales, Victoria and Western Australia, the creation of the new seat in Western Australia, and the removal of 2 seats in Victoria, one in Victoria and one in Sydney. Given that many boundaries have changed, we're currently looking to communicate with 1.3 million electors who will be voting in a different seat at this election. So we're doing that through letters to all of those electors, social media, and also through media releases and through events like this. So it's important that electors double-check those that have been potentially the subject of a redistribution, double-check the seat that they should be voting in. And the Northern Territory redistribution will take effect on the 4th of March, should a writ not be issued prior to that date. So the electoral roll, as at the end of December, so sort of less than just under 4 weeks ago, we've got 17.93 million people on the electoral roll, which is the largest electoral roll in Australia's history. That's an enrolment rate of 97.8%, and just by comparison in 2022 it was 96.8%. We would love for that to be at 98% by the time the election comes around, and we'll be continuing to work hard between now and the election and also through the close of rolls period to see if we can try and achieve that outcome. We've got the best youth enrolment rate for an election at 89.7%, which is higher than what it was in 2022. And we've also got the largest number of Indigenous electors on the electoral roll at 643,000, which is up 75,000 since June 24, I should say. Overall, we've got about an additional 700,000 electors on the electoral roll since the 2022 federal election, and you've got a snapshot in your handouts of some of this data. The electoral roll is an incredible success story both for the AEC and for Australia, and it is envied by many countries and election management bodies around the world. Australians are absolutely engaged in elections and being on the roll, and we are very much looking forward to servicing nearly 18 million electors. Nominations forms are now available on our website. We posted those, I think, earlier last week. That is to enable people to start the preparation process for nominating. Nominations don't open, of course, until the writ has been issued, but there's a fair bit of work in that for parties and candidates, so we've given them the opportunity to start planning and preparing. As many of you would know, we don't declare nominations until about 11 days after the writ has been issued, and that information will appear on our website shortly after those declarations have occurred right around the country. And a Section 44 checklist will also be published, but as you would know, it's not the role of the AEC to be disqualifying candidates. And a new candidate guidance has also been released last week, which includes authorisations and party working considerations, so we encourage you to have a look at that website. With respect to voting, again, another area where Australia is incredibly proud of what we are able to deliver. We have the best access to polling services in the world. Many of you would be aware that many countries have a single polling place where your name is on the door. It's called precinct voting. That's your only polling place, and that's and sometimes even you get told which table you have to go to. But in Australia, you can pretty much vote everywhere, anywhere. Particularly in the 2 weeks of pre-poll voting. So for this election, we'll have approximately 570 early voting centres, 7,000 polling places, a large number of mobile polling teams that will be servicing remote communities, nursing homes, homeless shelters, some hospitals and many prisons. And we are planning to have about 110 overseas voting centres with the support of DFAT and Austrade, which should be servicing Australians in around about 81 countries. And obviously there's also postal voting options and telephone voting for blind and low vision and Antarctic electors. And you'll understand, of course, that the final numbers of those is still subject to final stages of planning and implementation. Much of that will determine by the date of the election. But we're working hard to try and achieve those numbers. I might just talk about queuing for a moment, because sometimes it can become a bit of a favourite topic. It's not our favourite topic, and it's something that we do our very, very best to minimise, noting that voters can pretty much vote anywhere in Australia, and with 33 days' notice, we actually don't even know the date. So it's incredibly difficult for us to predict. But despite that, our data indicates that about 75% of voters are in and out of the polling place in 15 minutes or less, which is pretty extraordinary. I think we should say there will be some queues. That's inevitable, but we are doing our very, very best to minimise that. And as always, we ask voters to plan their vote. Another thing that's uniquely fantastic about Australia's election is our magnificent temporary election workforce, which we can't deliver the election without. We will be hiring 100,000 people in that 33-day period to deliver the election. That makes us, on polling day, around about Australia's third largest employer. So it's a massive escalation. We are currently advertising for people who want to come and work for us, who want to be champions of democracy. And I want to use this opportunity to say to people, if you want to come and work at the election, please apply through our website. And we're always looking for more people, and particularly in regional parts of Australia. And as I said, we cannot run the election without those wonderful people. So when you see them at the polling booth, please be kind to them. They are members of the community, friends, family, parents, who are out there doing their community service, and we'll be asking all voters to treat them with kindness. Just some of the logistics, again, approximate numbers, because we don't know exactly how it's going to land, but 250,000 pencils, approximately 80,000 ballot boxes, approximately 40,000 transport routes, 15,000 electronic certified lists, which is a big uplift since the last election. That will be covering all of the pre-poll voting centres right around the country, and also some voting on polling day. About 11.8 million official householder guides will also be distributed once the date is known. We'll be running, again, a very widespread advertising campaign, as we always do. It'll be the same campaign as what we ran in 2022, translated into 59 languages, 34 called and 25 First Nations languages. And at the moment, we've already delivered pretty much just under 300 community education sessions to multicultural communities and First Nation communities across Australia, and depending on the election date, we hope to increase that number substantially. As always, on social media, we'll have a very active presence again, probably the most active presence in the Commonwealth Government during the election, of course, demands absolute attention and response, and we're surging our social media team to assist us with that. We'll be doing, as we always do, everything we can to protect the integrity of the electoral process and responding to any mis and disinformation about the electoral process. We'll be running our disinformation register and capturing and countering mis and disinformation about the electoral process on that register, and I think that's just gone live this morning for this election. And we'll also be running again our Stop and Consider campaign to help increase levels of digital literacy. That's been a very, very successful campaign. At the referendum, we had over 200 million impressions and over 290,000 click-throughs to our website. That was already more than double than what occurred in 2022. Stop and Consider campaign will not just be returning, but it will also be expanded for this election. We've got information on our website for you to have a look at. It's practical tips for voters about how to identify but mainly counter mis and disinformation, stop and consider the source, and also giving them some tips with respect to, if you see mis and disinformation, ignore it, don't share it, perhaps even report it to the platform. So that will be a very, very important feature of our communication throughout the election. So I might leave it there and happy to open it up for questions, which I think you're going to moderate.
I'm going to point at people when they say something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the features of the last election was turnout, because from my memory it's the lowest turnout since compulsory voting. Do you think the turnout drop is because you're actually getting far more people onto the roll? It's part of that process?
It's a bit of a few things, actually. So that's actually one feature, of course. So the more people we put on the roll, turnout is a percentage of enrolment. So if enrolment's going up, then that impacts turnout. COVID in 2022, I think, was also a feature, despite all of the efforts that we went to with respect to that. But also more broadly across Western democracies, we are seeing a general decline in turnout. And there's a piece there around civic engagement in not just democracy, but also just even community groups and sporting groups and volunteerism. So there is a global trend there that we're grappling with. We'll be doing everything we can to try and get the best possible turnout right around the country. But I might also point out you have a great role in helping promote people turning out to vote. So do political parties and candidates. So we're looking for as many people as possible to vote.
On mis and disinformation, you talked about education programs, but what sort of powers do you have to combat fake videos, rubbish? Do you have takedown powers? Who can you bring in?
We don't actually have any actual powers in our Electoral Act, but for Section 329 of the Electoral Act is around misleading and deceptive communication. So, has been narrowly interpreted by the High Court with respect to actually how a voter completes the ballot paper. So if there is deceptive videos or mis and disinformation with respect to you must complete the ballot paper this way, and that is incorrect, that is actually a criminal offence and a matter that would investigate and prosecute. We also have obviously a regulatory role around the authorisation of political communication. So we'll be again ramping up our legal team and investigating any complaints that we receive with respect to political communication not being properly authorised. And of course we also continue to work closely with the social media platforms, and where there is a breach of their rules, then we'll be asking them to enforce those rules.
Just go here and put it there.
Spoke a lot in the lead up to the Voice referendum about some of the threats that electoral workers faced from certain parts of the community. Is that something that you're noticing again in the lead up to this election? Are you able to talk at all about the nature of some of those kinds of threats, if that is an issue?
Look, I think it's probably too early to tell for this election. Pleasingly, if I just reflect on a few state and territory elections that have occurred recently, there hasn't been a significant number of incidents. And I sincerely hope that there's no incidents at all at the next election, but it's something that we're alert to and we're preparing for. But I must say most of the poor behaviour, if I can put it that way, probably plays out online rather than actually in person. And that's an environment that we'll be monitoring very, very closely.
Obviously, there's a long way to go till the election, spiritually. But we're expecting probably a pretty close vote, which individual seats could matter a lot. Can you give us a breakdown on what the counting will be like after election day, in the days afterwards? And is there any capacity, if it is very close and a certain number of seats will decide the outcome, to speed that up at any point?
Yes and no. I mean, the no part first is, we're obviously bound by the Electoral Act and we must follow every step of the Electoral Act. And a critical part of that is, of course, waiting 13 days for all votes to go back to their home division, whether that's postal votes or coming from overseas. We cannot speed that up and we must wait. So that's sort of the no part. In terms of the yes part, we're also obviously monitoring data really closely. There's polling data, of course, but we'll obviously monitor the count data incredibly closely from polling night and in the days following. And we have the ability to swing some resources around to some extent. All counts still need to progress. They still need to be finalised in a timely way, but we'll have some capacity to try and prioritise that as best we possibly can.
And what will the counting process look like after election night? Vaguely.
Well, I mean, let me start with election night. I mean, election night we aim to count all pre-poll votes again. That's, again, something that's fairly unique to the AEC. You'd probably be aware, many of you, that we start to actually unfold ballot papers at 4 p.m, pre-poll ballot papers at 4 p.m. in our 60-odd count centres, so that we can actually start counting at 6 p.m. and try and get a timely result, because some of those are counts of 20 to 25, maybe even larger, 1,000 ballot papers. So that is a huge undertaking. And then, of course, counting occurs in every polling place right around the country. So there's another 7,000 results to come in. We'll also be looking to try and do a postal count in each of the divisions for the first time on polling night, just to try and get some sort of an indication about what the early trend of a postal count might be. So we'll try and do at least one. And then, of course, Sunday is a very, very big day. Oh, sorry, I should say, not to forget the Senate. We'll do the first preference count of the Senate as we normally do. Sunday is a very big day of logistics, votes, getting back to declaration votes, getting back to home divisions and getting ourselves set up. And then we are into it in earnest in doing our fresh scrutiny right around the country, which is effectively, doing the count again to finalise that process as quickly as we possibly can.
In terms of misinformation, is there any change in focus on what platforms you're focusing on? I know X, formerly Twitter, has taken off a lot of the guardrails in recent months, but also looking more heavily on vertical video, TikTok, things like that?
Yeah, well, at the moment we're still using all the same platforms that we've been using for quite a while and monitoring for quite a while, and we'll continue to consider what other options we might want to explore up to and potentially during the election.
Have any platforms become particularly bad offenders since the last election?
Look, I would say what we're seeing is some platforms are changing their rules or moderating the way in which they're conducting their business, and we're making adjustments accordingly.
And regarding, were you going to say something, Evan?
All good. We'll go to Mike next. Yeah.
Sorry.
You're right. I don't mind.
I just wanted to make it, just because we were still talking about disinformation. I remember last time we had this briefing ahead of the 22 election, there were some quite key pieces of disinformation that you guys were more concerned about. I think it was some of the voting machines or whatever. People were spreading some pretty clear ones that you were hyper-focused on. Are there any specific pieces this time, or is it actually not that specific and you're just on the eye out more broadly?
I would say at the moment we're just more broadly, and probably again a little too early for things to be really trending strongly. We're very alert to conspiracy theories, and that was certainly one of them about you can't use Dominion voting machines in Australia. Not that we ever have. So the conspiracy theories, unfortunately, are still out there. They're the ones that we'll be countering very, very strongly and using our disinformation register again to do so. But I think it's a bit early for any sort of really clear and strong trends. But
yeah, we see bits and pieces of the same stuff, but it just doesn't seem to be taking hold, which is pleasing. But we'll see what develops. Sorry, just go to Mark because he's going to get mad with me.
We don't.
Jeff, just a couple of points that I didn't hear in the data you rattled off. What's your expectation on the percentage of pre-polls and postals this time around? Because there was a big jump, obviously, COVID, and we're up above 50 and I think just above 50 in the referendum. Yeah. So what's your expectation this time around? How much is this election going to cost? And how many of those 700 additional voters will be 18-year-olds, first-timers?
All right, let me start with the first question. We obviously see continuing growth of pre-poll voting here in Australia, and that's not just at the Commonwealth level but also in the states. And there is also a differing of legislation too, which can create some confusion and misunderstanding with voters. But we still have you still need to be able to be eligible for an early vote in the Commonwealth, in the federal election, I should say. Despite that, what we're still seeing is the growth, and I probably expect it'll come in with pre-poll voting and postal voting probably around that 50% mark. Is sort of what we're broadly expecting, and what we're planning for. With respect to the cost, great question. We've been allocated $470 million for this election. The cost is incredibly variable on a whole range of factors. So And quite often we actually don't know the exact cost until almost 12 months after the election by the time we get all of the invoices from all of the providers back in. So, it's big. It's getting close to, potentially a $500 million project that we've got to land with no fixed date. It's which is pretty spooky. But so I can't give you anything further with respect to that. And the 18-year-olds.
Looked it up.
Good.
So I don't have 18-year-olds specifically. I've got 18 to 19-year-olds, so that 2-year age bracket. As of the end of last year, it was 446,000 nationally. So I might go over
That's
there.
all right. I was going to ask pre-polling expectation figures, so we're on the same page, so it's fine.
We've got this misinformation campaign. How much are you spending to push this message out on Facebook and Instagram and... obviously, what are you going to spend to get your message where people will see it?
Yeah, I don't actually have the total spend off the top of my head, but I can say we've just been given another $1.9 million to further expand the Stop and Consider campaign, and that was part of in the MyEFO budget. So,
and will most of that be spent pushing it out on the social media?
Yes.
Yeah.
There's other forms of digital advertising that are part of it as well.
Sorry, did anyone else want to? No. Didn't want to cut anyone off. A few years ago, it was either 19 or 22, we saw problems in Chisholm with people using the purple colours and saying how to vote. Just wondering if you've alerted parties to not misrepresent AEC colours, or how you're kind of tackling that, because on polling day, by the time you get complaints issued to take it down, you have, potentially it's up for hours.
Yeah, well, look, we don't own the colour purple as much as we would love to, but it's an ongoing challenge. So, look, parties and candidates can use whatever colour they want to use. The issue with respect to Chisholm and the issue with respect to the Court of Disputed Returns around that was not just the colour purple or the purple and white signs. There was the content of that sign, which goes back to what I spoke about earlier, being deceptive in terms of how to complete your ballot paper. And it was the proximity of those signs being placed close to AEC signs in purple and white, which made the elector potentially think this was an AEC sign, not a sign from a party. So it's not solely about purple and white, it's actually about the placement and the proximity to AEC signs, and then clearly the message. They can, not that we want them to, but they could put, vote 1 for, which is a normal sign properly authorised in purple and white. We don't want that near AEC signs, and we discourage that. And we quite often talk to candidates and we quite often talk to parties about the colour purple in particular, and about being very careful in how that is being used. But we can't regulate it any further than that.
So do you send official correspondence ahead of the vote? Have you already, or do you just meet with party directors and kind of informally say, don't misappropriate our colours?
We tackle that in a number of different ways, and it'll depend on the circumstances, but largely all of the above.
Are you worried they'll ignore you this time?
Look, as I said, it's a free and fair election, and parties and candidates are entitled to do a whole range of things that we don't regulate. Sometimes we'd prefer they didn't, and we might have a quiet discussion with them and ask them politely not to do that, but we can't generally compel them unless it's clear in the legislation.
There's also only so many colours to choose from, which is a general thing.
Yeah.
Just on political advertising as well, has the AUC identified any trends, whether rising or declining or sort of staying the same, in terms of complaints made about political advertising in recent elections? Obviously, with the rise of online, social media, there's a lot more stuff that can go out.
Yeah, look, again, probably not yet, and probably a little early to tell. We had 900 complaints around political advertising and authorisation related issues at the last, I think at the referendum. Or was it the last election? Might have been at the last election, actually. I'm expecting probably at least that, maybe even potentially more, given the issues that you've just outlined.
And just on the amount that the AUC actually conducts investigations into, what sort of percentage is that, given Obviously, the AEC has limited powers.
Yeah, well, look, they're all looked at, and we triage our way through those, and we take a risk-based approach. And there'll be some where the breach may be incredibly minor, but also rectified incredibly quickly, and a vast majority of people actually do that. And obviously, we put more resources into the ones that we feel are a bit more serious or a bit more egregious.
Yeah. And just one more follow-up. How is the AEC investigating these matters when you can't necessarily find the actors behind who's sharing some of this potentially misleading information online? Trying to find out who's actually the one creating it and then not just disseminating it.
Yeah, and that does complicate it. So people using all sorts of variety of names on social media makes it a little more complex. But we do our very best to try and work our way through that. And sometimes, we do have powers to issue notices to compel information to be provided to us, and we have used those notices in the past.
Just on election night evening planning, what things are the AEC bringing in this year to help us with our broadcasts, such a tally room? Is there anything new that's on the agenda, or how are we going to implement our election night broadcasts?
So one thing that we're doing is we're looking at providing access into more of our counting centres. So during the referendum for the first time, so there's always been requests, you want to go to a particular polling place or whatever the case might be. During the referendum, we opened the doors to one of our central counting centres, and I think there was some really good footage there, and people were doing interviews on the side of where the counts are being conducted, and they're large-scale warehouse-type places. We're looking at providing at least one venue per state or territory for that. So as the election night broadcast goes on, obviously there's different time zones, the number of them depending on if it's daylight savings times or not. And so that will be helpful. As part of that, I imagine 5 or so of them will probably be capital cities, metropolitan, but we're going to try and chuck in a couple of regional as well. So I think that's helpful. And in terms of information, shoot me a text. Otherwise, our tally room is operating in a very similar manner. We have a media feed there, which is raw data, which helps people, of course. That process is very similar as well. So there's a heck of a lot of data, and there's just a bit of increased visuals there for you to assist, and access and presence. Yeah.
Can I ask another couple of count questions? When you said, Jeff, earlier that the pre-polls will be opened at 4:30, are they batched at 4:30 and ready to go at 6, or are they just opened and ready to count? And secondly, just on the two-party preferred data flows, how nimble will they be through the night? Because we're thinking about a lot of three-cornered contests and possibly four-cornered contests in this campaign.
Yeah. No, I might just correct, it was actually 4 o'clock. It's 4 p.m. is when we're, under legislation, allowed to open the pre-poll ballots. But I'll ask Kath to give you some detail on that.
So, Mark, the opening of pre-poll ballot boxes from 4 p.m. was a legislative change introduced for the 2022 federal election. It means that in a very controlled environment in our count centres, those 60-odd centres that the Commissioner mentioned earlier, our staff open those ballot boxes in the presence of scrutineers, so scrutineers are able to view that opening process. Ballot papers are removed from the ballot box, unfolded, and a preliminary sort, but strictly no counting. The scrutineers, there's an embargo because in some counts, as you'll appreciate, the piles can be indicative, but there is an embargo on providing any of that information outside. And then we wait for 6 p.m. and the close of polls before any counting takes place. It just means that we get a head start on those really big counts that the Commissioner mentioned, those 25, 30,000.
So but not counted.
Correct.
What we used to have, and I used to get a lot of questions about, is we'd have a story developing at a certain time in the night, 8:30 or whatever it was, and then you'd have a big gap until some of the pre-polls came through. So that's what it's designed to do, and has been quite good for us in terms of coverage. So.
Yes.
And the two-party.
Yes. So on the two-candidate preferred count, as you would all be aware, the AEC sets two candidate preferred settings for the event to enable our officers in charge of polling places to provide an indication of who's likely going to win the seat. They are only indicative, and we're using past data to inform that, but also keeping an eye on media and candidate changes in seats. The redistributions will be a factor here, of course. As a general rule, we set it conservatively and think about what happened at the last election. And so sometimes we don't get it right, and that's particularly the case in seats where there's a new up-and-coming independent who perhaps hadn't been factored into the two-candidate preferred count. So we don't always get it right. I think at the last election we had around 10 what we call TCP exceptions, and we needed to do 3 candidate preferred counts in a number of seats. We expect that we'll need to do more of those, or we're preparing for the possibility that we might need to do more of those this event, and we're prepared for that. Doing 3 candidate preferred counts is something that we've done since 2016, but in a very small number of circumstances. But we're prepared for doing that in a larger number of seats. Now, importantly, to the earlier question about the tally room, it will still be the same process whereby if the TCP is incorrect, we'll have to mask the tally room and there'll be effectively nothing there for a short period of time while we reset the TCP, which may mean, in some of those trickier seats, doing a 3CP to determine who the 2 candidates are. So bear with us. It may be of interest to know that as part of our Indigo program, which some of you will know is replacing our legacy systems, we're baking this into the new design so that we'll be a bit more nimble in the future.
That's great. Will you let us know on the night when you're doing that in individual seats?
Yeah, so we'll have some ability through Evan to let you know that.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you.
Noting that sometimes it's not entirely apparent on polling night. It may be Sunday, Monday, even into the fresh scrutinies before we recognise that there's an exception.
Yeah. It depends on the level of interest in the exception as well, because some are not particularly interesting. Some are actually just trying to determine who is the second, and the first is very, very clear. Right? But some are very interesting. So how we communicate it will be depending on how much people want to know. So our socials, media releases, things of that nature, and again, hit me up by phone or email or whatever the case might be, and we're always there to chat. Yes. And the tally room itself will tell a story. Yeah.
My staff are telling me that it's an unreasonable performance measure to ask them to get all 150 correct, so they're trying to manage my expectations.
Just returning to complaints and investigations into political advertising. I realise this is obviously like a quite murky sort of area, but at what point does the AEC refer something to the AFP or ASIO or somewhere else?
Well, that's the reason why we have the Electoral Integrity Assurance Task Force, which has been with us since about 2018 Super Saturday, I think. So it's going from strength to strength, and that really is our right hand in terms of how we navigate our way through the environment and deliver the election. So we'll have all the intelligence agencies that are part of that task force, the AFP and a number of other organisations there, where we are sharing information and intelligence to understand the environment, and it's also a referral mechanism for matters that we feel like they're better placed to potentially investigate.
So sort of having meetings outside of the usual, I suppose, meetings. To determine if you've got a few in the caseload that might be something that AFP might be interested in.
I mean, the task force has been preparing in the lead up to this election, and as they do for every election, they'll be meeting every day, at least every day, if not sometimes multiple times a day throughout the election. So it's nimble, it's active, and it's ready to go.
How big is the investigation team in the AEC in terms of dealing with these complaints?
Well, we're surging. We have our legal team, which we surge. We have our Defending Democracy unit, which we're also surging to support the Electoral Integrity Assurance Task Force. So there's not exactly just one team. There are multiple capabilities and areas of expertise throughout the organisation that we're increasing our capacity in readiness for the election.
I'm just conscious there's a lot of people online, and I just wanted to ask if anybody online has a question now. I don't know if you can just turn your mics off and ask, or put your hand up, or whatever it might be, but if you're able to indicate if you have a question, let me know, because otherwise I'll keep on looking at the faces in the room. And I'm going to look at a face in the room while those people think about that. Yeah.
With the expansion of the Stop and Consider campaign, are you expanding, I know that you said that you'll be expanding that program, but are there specific demographics that you'll be targeting, in terms of age groups or, cultural groups, that kind of thing?
Well, it'll be pretty broad brush, to be honest, because we're finding misinformation is being consumed right across society. We will be translating it into multiple languages. I don't have the exact number with me just yet, but I think it's around more than just over 10 into called languages and also some Indigenous languages as well, to make sure we try and get into some of those communities.
But nothing in terms of age groups or...
I don't have anything in front of me at the moment. I think we're still trying to finalise exactly how we're going to spend some of that new money and interpreting some of the research that we've undertaken.
The channels of the campaign certainly do skew digital, and is that what you're going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say that's partly addressed through the channels that we target, and we also work with a range of partners, youth groups, community groups across the continent, and leverage them to get messages into community for particular groups that we think need to hear it more than others, perhaps.
You mentioned the quest to get to the magical 98% mark by the election. What areas, demographics, etc., age groups would you target to get that couple of extra enrolments?
Look, again, our advertising campaign for close of rolls is going to be huge. Like it is for most elections, it'll be all-encompassing, digital, mainstream. So we'll be targeting everybody, but the greatest growth is effectively 18 to 25-year-olds.
Just one on staffing for voting booths. Have you had any issue in the past of not being able to find anyone to do it? And does that mean you haven't had facilities open? Like, what is actually the kind of backup for that situation?
Yeah.
2022 as well.
2022, and again, I think the important context was there was a COVID election, but in 2022, just in the lead up to polling day, about the Wednesday, we had around 60-ish polling places that we were really struggling to staff. Most of those were in sort of regional WA, Queensland, and a little bit in South Australia. And in many of those communities, that was the only polling place. So if we couldn't open that, then unlikely people were likely to travel the 100 kilometres down the road to vote. So it was, for us, I mean, that was an incredibly confronting crisis because the AEC has never not opened a polling place. So we pulled out all stops, and I mean all stops, to work with all government agencies, both federal and state, and community groups, and we redeployed resources internally, and we opened up every one of those polling places. I mentioned specifically earlier, particularly regional Australia, because again, that looks like it's going to be the challenge. Hopefully nowhere near that extent, and our data's not indicating that at the moment. But again, until it comes down to the actual day of the polling, polling date being announced, we won't actually know until we get much closer. But we are calling out for people to come and work for us, particularly in regional Australia, to try and address that. But I can guarantee you, we will be doing everything we can to open every 7,000 polling places right around the country.
And I might also add that after the experience of 2022, we've got a whole, every layer of contingency you can possibly imagine, including flying some of our permanent staff into location if that's what's needed to open a polling place. And it might also use the opportunity to just make sure there's no ambiguity about the fact that we pay our staff to work for us. Yes. Oftentimes we hear them referred to as volunteers. They are not. They're paid positions. It's a modest payment, but you're doing something for the community as well. So.
Federal elections obviously happening at a time where there are a lot of challenges to social cohesion because of overseas conflicts. Has the AEC made any changes, or is there consideration to increasing security at polling booths in certain electorates?
Well, look, we're very closely monitoring the environment in which the election's been delivered, and again, that's one of the great reasons we have the Electoral Integrity Assurance Task Force. And through that task force and through our relationship, with the AFP in particular, and also the state and territory police forces, for many elections we work closely with them. We coordinate the sharing of information and intelligence between agencies. So we're monitoring it very closely. We have not made any demonstrable changes yet, and I hope that we do not have to. For me, it will be an incredibly sad day for Australia if we have to put some form of security out the front of a polling place, and I hope that we never see that. And we're doing everything possible with the security agencies to ensure that that is not required.
an ongoing conversation at this point. Obviously, we don't know when the election will be, but
Yeah, that's right. And as I said, we're working closely with the agencies. We're in discussions with them at the operational level. We're monitoring very closely about their prioritisation and allocation of resources. And at the moment, I'm comfortable that they're focused in the areas that will also suit our purposes.
On the disinformation point, who are you most worried about spreading disinformation? Are there particular groups that you're seeing that are spreading this? Are you worried about overseas actors at all? Is there any kind of particular source of this disinformation about the electoral process that you guys are worried about at this point?
Look, I think our experience would indicate that it's domestic. It's we're doing this to ourselves, which is one of the sort of sad things about how some of this is playing out. And it's not just for elections, and it's not just for democracy, but it's right across all elements of society. So we're seeing sovereign citizens and conspiracy theorists and keyboard warriors who don't want to reveal their identity, but they do want to stir the pot and cause problems. And that's why I think the way in which social media is evolving and the moderation and adjustments of social media rules, platform rules, I think the best thing we can do, which is actually support the voter in how to navigate this information environment. And it's becoming complex, and we're increasing our level of support proportionally to try and help them with that. But it's always been the voter's role, right from the first election, to actually navigate through the information environment. It would have started off in the town square with a little bit of exaggeration and a little bit of hyperbole and a stretch of the truth, and now we're in a very different environment. But the voter's role hasn't changed, and we want to support them as best we can to navigate through that. And at the end of the day, they walk into that voting screen with the 2 bits of paper and a pen or a pencil. Again, just picking up pen on conspiracy theories. A pen or a pencil, we don't mind, and it's just them in silence with their independent thought, and we ask them to think their way through their vote very carefully. But I think also just a quick bit of context. There's some good literature coming out at the moment that whilst disinformation is ubiquitous, I haven't met anybody who's actually changed the way they vote because of a post on X or Facebook or an image that they've seen. Most people form their voting intentions based on their personal values, based on the environment which they've grown up, based on the policies and how that affects their family and their business and their personal lives. So it's important context, but we're confident that Australians can continue to navigate their way through it.
You say there's good literature about this. Is there recent studies or data about how people use or don't use misinformation?
I've certainly read some recent articles. I'm not sure about the data, but I've certainly read some recent articles. And the Alan Turing Institute in the UK is actually producing some really interesting information around mis and disinformation.
I was just going to do another call out to people online because I did a bit of a dodgy one last time. If you do want to jump in, just take yourself off mute and go for it. I'll give it a good 20 seconds to see if anybody takes that up. I'll sit here very awkwardly. I'm going to take that as a no. Yep.
Sort of continuing on that vein, how important or are they losing importance are media fact checks on misinformation that might be going around, like for the AEC, for example, because obviously your hands are tied on being the arbiters of truth. Not necessarily media is the arbiter of truth either, but have you found that? Yeah.
Well, fact checkers generally play in a different space to us. We are protecting the electoral process. They tend to play in the space more around the truth of campaign-related matters. So, I think everyone's got an important role to play in terms of helping voters navigate through the election.
We have had some, sharp points where there's been a lot of discussion about electoral processes in the past, and what I would say is the role of media representatives has been critical, because while we like to think we have a big voice, and sometimes we do if it's a really sensitive issue and it's getting a lot of attention, but we don't have your voice, right? So it's, as far as I'm concerned, in the line of my work during the heat of a federal election, when it's electoral process based and it is involving our stuff, that God, there's a sigh of relief when there's a really fact-based, piece of information that's going out on scale. It's great.
Are you worried about?
I'll come to you after.
Are you worried about misinformation from being spread by particular political candidates? I know we've seen some people who are running certain political parties, even certain elected members of parliament, spreading misinformation about electoral processes. Is that something that concerns you?
When it relates to the electoral process, yes, we'll absolutely address that.
Things like, I think, Ralph Babbitt posting online about voting machines and that kind of thing.
I haven't seen that one.
No, I haven't seen that one either. But it's, I think no matter who the person is, obviously if they're a political candidate, they're likely to have a bit more of a profile and a bit more of a voice, and it might resonate a little bit more than some other sources. But as Jeff said, when it's about the electoral process, my team, Jeff, Kath, whoever it is, will be pretty quick to talk about it in factual terms. It's a sticky area for the AEC in the middle of an election campaign to provide adverse commentary against what a candidate is saying. But when it's about the electoral process, that's our role. Section 7 of the Act is about educating people about the electoral process, and we're the authoritative source on the process that we run. So regardless of the source, if it's about the process, yes, that would be of concern, and we will address it quickly, hopefully too.
Just a question around any expectations of changes or lack thereof around the level of informal or spoiled ballots.
We're also working really hard to try and reduce informal votes, and that's very much the subject of a lot of that community engagement that I spoke about, those sort of 300 sessions, particularly in...
Increase in the 2022.
It was moderate. My memory.
Yeah, it was.
Figures, but it was a slight
I think it was
increase.
A slight increase in the House, and actually a slight decrease in informality in the Senate, which somewhat feels a little counterintuitive sometimes. But it's influenced by so many factors again, and we're on it. It's a big part of those community engagement sessions with multicultural and Indigenous communities. There'll be a huge part of our advertising campaign, as it always is. But it can be affected by a range of other factors external to the AEC, for instance, proximity of other elections, such as Western Australia. So there's some elements of risk with respect to that we'll be looking to navigate through.
Just for newer voters who, for the referendum, might have been their first voting experience, does that present a challenge for making sure ballots are appropriately filled out?
Yeah, well, again, yes, it's a risk, and through our advertising campaign and everything that we'll be doing, which will be flooding the market with this sort of information, and also the instructions that we give at the issuing of the vote, we're confident that they'll adjust.
There's also, might be worth a plug for our practice voting tool. So there's lots of really good resources on the AEC website, but a practice voting tool that just gives voters visibility of what the House and the Senate ballot paper look like, and it's got clear instructions on it, plus the instructions that they get in the polling place. If they stick to that, plus our officers in polling places with language skills where ABS data indicates that's a need. So with those resources, we're pretty confident we're in a good position to keep informality low.
That's all very much around informal votes, but what about deliberately spoiled ballots? Is that again, is there a trend in either direction, or has that been fairly static across recent polls?
The data that we have indicates it's pretty static. I think it's worth mentioning that in a compulsory system where it's compulsory for electors to enrol and then compulsory to vote, there's no compulsion on what you put on the ballot paper. So I think that's an important element. But the data that we get after each election when we look at those tends to show that there's been no significant increase in deliberate informality.
Now it's about 4 minutes left, so we'll keep going, but I'm just conscious that we will have to wrap up.
On the informal vote sort of process. Considering we've had Tasmanian and ACT elections, different systems, do we know if that tosses up more informal votes at federal elections after? Is that anything of concern?
It can do. Although Tasmania is probably the jurisdiction that does most voting in Australia.
They're very good. Their levels of informality are...
They're very well versed in Tasmania with respect to voting, so, but it can be a factor. Yeah.
The other thing that can be a factor is simply how many candidates are on the ballot paper in a particular division.
Yes.
That's been found to be a correlating factor. We're all quiet. Well, that might be it. Thank you very much. Very much appreciate it.
Thanks,
take your goodies if you like them, and give me a call if you need to.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.